And speaking of the screencast question, what the substance was, a few people noticed a reference to something called TED Ed. If you noticed that, ignore it. Don't worry about it. You're all good if you went on Alexa's Classroom, viewed the videos, and then answered the questions from the link. And if you had trouble with that, come see me either at the break or after class, and we will figure it out. Okay, so speaking of the screencasts, I will try to address your questions that you put in the last question about screencasts as we go through class today. If I don't address your question, please let us know, and I will try to do so today. Also, I am going to hope moving forward, and we'll see as we go, that I have convinced you with the main theme of at least the first screencast, and that is that it is worth starting with secondary sources much of the time. But before we talk specifically about secondary sources, and yes, for those of you who asked, we are going to go into more detail about ALR and treatises and other encyclopedias today. So hopefully, again, I will answer those questions. If not, let me know. But what I wanted to talk about very briefly, one of your handouts is a sample research log. It's possible that you spoke about this way back in your first year in legal writing. Your professor may have mentioned the idea of keeping a research log. And yes, it is a little bit of extra work, but if you anticipate a very long, in-depth research project like the one we have for our client, or you anticipate that you're going to get interrupted, which is going to happen a lot. I'm sure it happens a lot to you now. It's going to happen a lot to you when you're in practice. You're going to be working on something, and then another supervisor, partner, senior associate is going to come and say, hey, I need you to come and work with me for a little while. And 2 weeks later, you go back to your first project, and if you don't remember what you did, you have to start over from scratch. So the sample research log I gave you is also on the course page. And again, most of my organization is going to go around in the modules. So you will find the research log suggestion, which is the exact piece of paper I gave you, but it's a Word document. So this way, if you're interested, you can download it, and there's actually a table you can fill out, and the table will expand automatically and all that good stuff. This is not the end-all and be-all of research logs. There are a whole lot of different ways of looking at it. Include the information that makes sense to you, again, with the idea of, okay, if I get interrupted and I have to come back to this in 2 weeks, and I've been really busy, so I'm not going to remember much of what I did, what do I want to know? So again, I gave you what I would guess I would want to know, but it may be different for you. And the idea is do what's useful. Any questions about research logs? Excuse me. Okay, now let's dive in to secondary sources. Okay, so where we left our story was investigating Google. And we had worked on this particular terminology as one search. There are lots of other terms that we generated that might be worthwhile trying. And again, on Google, it's easy, it's free, so why not? So there's no reason you have to keep with this structure. That's just what I put in large part because it's easy to type, but there are other good searches as well. And as you remember in looking at some of these sources, realizing that maybe this Reed Smith is a law firm and what they're trying to do is get clients, but they may give us some kind of introduction that we're not going to rely on, but terminology. So we learned that ERISA is something we have to worry about. And in taking a look, we also, I think, identified this health plan liability, and this, remember, was a NIH, National Institute of Health, if you didn't know, .gov. So we know that that is going to be reliable as far as it gets us. And in looking at that site, we started to learn quite a bit about what we might want to think about. So the ERISA stands for this whole employee retirement, supersedes state laws as they relate to employer-based health care plans. So that means we have to start thinking about, all right, what does this mean? So it says cases brought under ERISA are heard in federal courts. All right, so do we have to start thinking about do we need to go to federal court and just forget about state court? So it goes on to tell us about laws passed in 10 states, and that they were in June 2004, there's a U.S. Supreme Court case, and that the case basically said that the action brought was preempted by ERISA. So do we have to worry about our state law action being preempted? And then our article goes on to tell us more about U.S. healthcare delivery, which might be useful to know if you don't know much about the healthcare insurance market. And then it even goes on to tell us about two types of liability, contract and tort. So it's even starting to give us some theories of how we might go ahead for our client. We might want to look at the contract, and we talk about getting the insurance contract. We might want to look about tort liability. And then it even goes on to tell us about malpractice. And I think we brought that up last time, right? Malpractice? Anybody remember? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't, but in reading this, we would be reminded. How about that? And then it goes on to give us detail about ERISA. So again, we got lucky here. You can't always count on getting lucky and getting a nice government reliable website that talks pretty close and gives us ideas, but when you do, you take it. And interestingly, I think last time this particular page was on the second page of our Google results. And today, as you see, it's on my first page. That could be because Google bumped up its ranking because I've been looking at it a lot as we talked about it, and I've been preparing for class. So Google gives you 10,000 results. I'm not going to tell you to look at 10,000. I'm not going to tell you to look at 1,000. Look at a couple of pages, because sometimes even on the second, maybe third page, you'll find, you wouldn't have wanted to miss this because this really clues us into a lot of important issues that we're going to have to think about. It even talks about case law, though we already found out about a Supreme Court case we might be interested in. Here's more discussion on case law. And then it goes into state laws. So really pretty good find that we wouldn't have wanted to miss. Okay, so that reminded us where we were from last week in terms of our investigation for our client. So now that we have investigated Google and gotten hopefully what we can out of it, again, you don't want to spend 3 hours doing that. Your time is money. Time to look at more targeted legal sources, again, reliable. So here's where we're going to dive into the meat, if you will, of secondary sources. And as I mentioned in the screencast, a lot of times a good place to start is encyclopedias. They're pretty general, they're basic, they're introductory. I'm not going to tell you always start in encyclopedias. For some issues, you're not going to find anything. For some issues, they're not very useful. You'll learn to get judgment in that in terms of, do I really just need something basic, or do I know enough to dive in and be more detailed? So I know a couple of you asked that in the screencast. It's an excellent question, but as I mentioned last class, one of the reasons this class exists is that there is no easy answer. There is no start step number 1 and go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's never a single step number 1. It depends on your issue. It depends on your knowledge. It depends on how much time you have. Maybe you just need a quick and dirty answer, so then you probably might just go to Google and an encyclopedia. It may be you need a more in-depth, and it's really complicated, like this whole ERISA stuff, where you need to go far more in-depth. Okay, so what we are going to do is actually start, sort of, with a workshop looking at some of the secondary sources that you looked at in the screencasts. My main reason for having you watch the screencasts outside of class is that so we can get some hands-on experience. I can answer some of your questions, and then we'll all discuss together and hopefully get a better sense of what these are and what they will do for us. So there are 21 of you, so I'm going to divide class into 5 groups. So there'll be, and I'm just going to do it randomly this time, just to keep things simple and quick. So I'm going to, and you'll all have to remember which group you're in. So, okay, I'm going to try with the names here. Anik, Danielle, Michael, or Mike?
Either one. Either
one. So Michael, Zainab, and Yaroslav, you're going to be group number 1, and you're going to look at ALR. You can work together, you can work individually. What I will do is I will ask one person from each group to come up and input into the computer what the rest of the group is directing you to do. So actually the person who comes up has the easy job because they just have to type. Okay, so you're group 1 and you are going to look in ALR. Now don't start yet because I'm going to divide up the groups and then we're going to investigate, talk a little bit about how you're going to go about doing this, and then we'll do it. But just remember your group 1 ALR. So group 2, okay, Mafi, Steffi, Rosa, James, and Alex. You're group 2, and you are going to look at Amger. Okay. Group 3, Jacqueline, Rebecca. Okay. Eli, Jessica. Oh, I'm going to have to split you guys up. Sorry about that. And Jessica. So, I got 1. So you're group 3, right? I've lost track already. So 1, 2, 3. Group 3, you're going to look at CJS, which stands for Corpus Juris Secundum. And just fair warning, you're going to do that on Westlaw because it doesn't exist on Lexis. And I'm going to show you how to find all of these once I've got the groups. And so group 4, oh, I see what I did wrong. Rats. Okay, group 4, Nick, Ashley, Allison, Amy, and Josh. You're going to look at New York jurisprudence. So everybody have a group and everybody know what they're looking for. Okay, so quick review on how to go about doing this. I know some of you are probably familiar, but again, just so we're all on the same page. Oh, and you can choose Lexis or Westlaw, whatever you prefer, except for the CJS group. Like I said, you have to do Westlaw. So if we're on Westlaw, as many of you know, you can just plug in your name. So if you're lucky, you can plug in the abbreviation. So I said Amger for American Jurisprudence. You're lucky, so Amger works. If Amger didn't work, then you just have to spell out the name. So for our CJS group, same applies. If I type in CJS, looks like Westlaw knows CJS. At least it does for me, again, because these systems adapt. On your computer, it may not. So if you have to type out Corpus Juris Secundum, then that's how it works. And the same works for ALR. So I did ALR, Amger, CJS, and New York Jur. So the same works on Westlaw for all of those. On Lexis, same thing. You can just type in if you're a Lexis person. And whoops, if you don't hit enter and get to your wrong search, Lexis is a little fetchy when it comes. See, now it stops doing it. If you type it in on yours, it should come up. Again, Amger, New York Jur, any of those will work just typing it in. If, however, now this works for this assignment, but really when, a bunch of you asked in the screencast, what's the best way to do this? And I would recommend, if you know you need secondary sources, and we know we do because we know we got to learn about ERISA and HMO liability and preemption and all of that. And I don't know about you, but I certainly don't know much about ERISA. So it may be that you want to limit to secondary sources. So again, right here on the Browse menu, you can do it on the left here. Before I did that, you could also do it over there. On Westlaw, there's a link here for secondary sources. And then you can narrow further, but what I would suggest is a general strategy, and you can do it for this exercise too, or you can go directly to your publication that I've assigned. You can run your search. So I'm going to run a sample search, not ours, because that's going to be your job. I've noticed. And on Westlaw, you can then filter. So what I mean by filter is here on the left, like you do on Amazon. You run your search, and then you filter by whatever it is you want that Amazon, the categories Amazon shows you. So same thing here. You can filter either by publication type. So we see ALR there. or on Westlaw by publication name. And your guess is as good as mine as to which you'll find it in, because Westlaw is always switching it around. So that's one reason. If I know I just want a specific publication, I'll just go straight to that. On Lexis, the same concept applies. Again, for a regular research strategy, again, there's always going to be exceptions to a rule. I would go to secondary materials and then again run my search. Again, you could narrow further here on this screen if you want, but as a general rule, I would rather start and maximize the likelihood that I am going to find something of use. Right now, we're talking specifically about what these individual publications do and how they're different and what they look like. But really, when you're out there researching, you don't really care whether you find it in ALR or AMJUR. You just want to find something useful, right? So that's why I recommend this strategy. Again, for our exercise, we're getting more specific, so you get more familiar, so that when you see your results, you say, well, I know what ALR does, and I know what AMJUR will do, and you have a sense of which one you might want to choose. So from here, again, you can narrow on Lexis and kind of do the same thing, whether it's under category or sources. You can click on more and see if you find what you're looking for here. Actually, it's more likely going to be in sources, so you see AMJUR there, New York jurisprudence. So that's how you would navigate the particular systems. And we're holding off on Bloomberg for now, and I'll explain why a little bit later. Okay. And I think I have explained how to get there. What I'm going to ask you to do in your respective publication is to find the best section for our client, so which section looks the best, and also, if you have time, look for promising research features. And as I said, I'll ask one person from each group to come up and drive, as they say, and then the rest of you have to help your colleague out. Okay, so a couple of groups are going to have it pretty easy, and a couple of groups aren't. Just fair warning. So if you're not finding anything, don't think, oh my God, I'm not doing anything right. It could be your publication just is one that isn't great for this issue. As I said, that's going to be true for every single issue. Not every publication is going to have every single issue. So that's part of the experience and learning when to stop and try something else. Okay, and the only other thing before we get started, let's just quickly think what some of the terms we're going to put in. Again, you're not limited to these terms, but just to get everybody's terminology choosing going. Okay, 1, 2. ERISA, HML liability. ERISA is going to be pretty broad. HMO liability, ERISA, anything else?
Preemption.
Preemption. Okay, again, if you choose one or the other, don't feel like you only have to use that. There could be multiple combinations of search terms that are useful. Any questions? I'll be wandering around. Please don't hesitate to ask if you have questions. Okay. An encyclopedia. Well, Google, we started encyclopedia, more basic resources like ALR. Again, you won't always find what you're looking for in encyclopedias. But I would say that might be a good start. I frequently, especially for state-specific issues, when I know it's just state and I just want my state, which isn't our case, but it is in other, I once had an attorney looking for something to do with the limit of models and the weight of underage models. But this attorney needed to know about what the New York law was in that. I wasn't going to send that attorney, say to that attorney, don't search in New York, because he needed to know what it was in New York. I sent him to New York Jur. And that, so frequently, if you just know you need your state, go to your state's encyclopedia if you're lucky enough to have one. Not all states do, unfortunately. If it's more general like ours, encyclopedia might be a good place to start. I'm going to throw ALR and even maybe proof of facts in that category. And as we saw, those were two great resources to start in. Actually, our traditional encyclopedias, Amjur, CJS, not so much. New York Juror for State was good, but the state wasn't going to inform us on the larger question of federal preemption, as well as HMO liability. So a next step you might want to take, or again, depending on your topic, might be a first step, is basically looking at what we librarians call current development resources. You don't really need to remember that. What you want to remember is this an issue I've been hearing a lot about? Do I think it's changing really a lot currently? And one example I like to give, or I'm going to give this year for that, is if you had a question regarding whether it's legal for the president to close the border. Honestly, our HMO liability question is probably not that current, so I wouldn't start in current development resources for our client's issue. But obviously for this one, it's pretty topical these days. So I might start in news resources. I might even start in general interest news resources, like whatever newspaper you like to read, New York Times, Washington Post. I would again try to limit myself to resources that are respected. And again, you could say, oh, well, then you're going to get a political bias. Some people say the Washington Post is politically biased. Some people say the Wall Street Journal is politically biased. They're both well-respected publications, so I might look at both of them to see if I get a different perspective depending on the politics, if you're talking about a political issue, which of course this is these days. So here we see a Washington Post. I might see if that might educate us some on the issue or even just on the terminology. So I see Washington Post, I could just even add my publication to get a different, the Wall Street Journal is considered to be a more conservative viewpoint. So here it talks about the wall, not so much closing the border, but we would see what we could find that way. If my question was a more strictly legal one, which our client certainly is, I would at some point, maybe in the beginning, maybe not toward the end, also look to more legal current development resources, and by that I mean legal newspapers. How many of you have heard of the New York Law Journal? Okay, great. Quite a number of you. New York Law Journal, especially if you are going to be practicing in New York, is a publication you're going to follow. And I can just say that flat out. You'll probably follow it online. They send you nice alerts. It does exist in paper, and depending on where you work, you may get it in paper too. But you will, so the New York Law Journal for New York Law may be a place that you want to start. Let's see if it's going to let me do this. Oh, yay, now it's popping up. And again, to get there the same way we've been doing. So I might want to see now I don't think so, but I might want to see, is anything developing in the risk of preemption or the HMO liability to be more general. And just so you can get a sense of what the New York Law Journal looks like, at least on Lexis. And I'm on Lexis specifically because the New York Law Journal is one of those publications that isn't on Westlaw. The publisher of the New York Law Journal and lots of legal newspapers across the country, American Law Media, is only on Lexis. They have an exclusive agreement with Lexis. Now that can change over time. 10 years ago, I think the exclusive agreement was with Westlaw. So I would have been having this chat with you looking at Westlaw. Now it's Lexis. It could change again. They also have their own website as well. And if you subscribe, you can gain access to their website and not go through Lexis, but this gives you better searching capabilities. So actually here's something that's a kind of old article. We could sort by date, but then you wind up with lots of irrelevant results, so I tend not to do that. And so here we see an example And it's just an article. And sometimes these articles, especially the New York Law Journal, can have for a short article, you know, it's newspaper length long. It's not a 50-page law review article. It can be really, really informative. I actually follow the New York Law Journal for an area I'm interested in, which is co-op and condo law, because I live in a co-op, so I want to see what's going on with the law. And they have excellent, excellent articles on that particular area. So what I've done is I've set up, once I found a good search, I have set up an alert. And I think one of you asked about setting up alerts. And so there is a way to do that on both Lexis and Westlaw. And it used to be, where did it go? No, it's not there. There used to be a little bell signal, and now Lexis has gone and changed it on me. So I will get back to you on how to set up alerts, but you can do that in both Lexis and Westlaw, usually in your search results. Let's actually go back here and see if it's on our search results page. Okay, I'll get back to you on how to set up alerts on Lexis and Westlaw. So that's New York Law Journal on Lexis. What you might want to do is search not just the New York Law Journal, but legal news generally. And again, because I'm on Lexis because of that ALM exclusive arrangement. So American Lawyer is on Lexis, National Law Journal. These are all some of the leading news publications. And so you can see ALM media. May or may not limit. I could just search all of legal news for our area. Okay, another way to search a area that's changing currently is to take a look at blogs. And actually a good way to research any area, not just changing currently, but overall, is actually to look for research guides. Why reinvent the wheel? I mean, we found a couple of good areas on ERISA, and that the other nice thing about this strategy is this is something that is free. So let's go back here. So I might want to, I realize, okay, I got to understand this ERISA and how it applies to health. I just need to do some basic reading. So I might want to find ERISA. So all I'm doing is our topic. I'm using the word law because we're on Google. So I want it law specific, and I'm finding guides on how to do research on ERISA. So here we see, usually you'll see a .edu because frankly we librarians like to write these research guides. So that's where you'll find them. And so here you see the University of Cincinnati's research guide. Again, I just found it through Google. And we've narrowed to treatises, and this will be one of the primary ways that you find treatises. We'll talk about that in a little while when we go into more detail on treatises. But you see general sources. It gives you some statutory law, administrative law, case law. So this is a great overall, whether your area is changing currently or not, to get guidance on how to search an area of law. Now we'll get to blogs in a minute. I'm going to go back because, again, another thing, just doing a general law search. We've already done our Google search, so we've already run across this article. Actually, I'm not sure. We didn't do an ERISA Google search. We did our HMO denial search. So this was another government website that we ran across doing ERISA law research. And so here we see a basic explanation about ERISA from the government. Why, again, I'm emphasizing the government is that, again, because ERISA falls under the Department of Labor, the Department of Labor may or may not have some guidance for us on how they interpret ERISA that may or may not be interesting to us. And because it is the Department of Labor and they do have jurisdiction, we want to know about that guidance. So this is pretty general, but I promised you last class that I was going to show you some advanced Google techniques. And so I'm going to keep that promise today. And what I'm doing is before the web address, so before the URL, I'm typing the word site, S-I-T-E, colon, there's no spaces, then I get my HTTP. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the basic part of the web address, so just dol.gov, departmentoflabor.gov. So that I want to search the entire Department of Labor website. I don't want to search just this page. I could do a Control F for that, right? Then after I have the site that I want to search, which is just the dol.gov site, then I'm going to put in my search term. So in this particular example, I'm going to try HMO denial because I've already seen the ERISA page. And what Google is doing by telling it SITE colon and then the URL, I'm telling Google, Google, I want you to search just this website. Not all of Google, because that's too much, just the Department of Labor. I just want to see where the Department of Labor has these terms. And it's whatever terms you want. And this, by the way, is a great tool for any Google search, not just legal research. So here we see where the Department of Labor is mentioning HMO denial. So we see a full report inside, and we see the name of whatever inside the black box of managed care decisions. Ours is a managed, we've now learned the term managed care. Ours is a managed care decision, right? So this might be really useful to see what the Department of Labor has to say about managed care decisions. So again, keeping your eye out for government sites, using the site, S-I-T-E, colon search for government. You can do it for other websites as well. So that's one of my favorite, if not my favorite, advanced Google technique. We'll be talking about others later on in the semester. Questions? Okay, now as I started to say, and again, if you think your area is changing a lot currently, you might want to take a look at blogs. I would honestly use this technique very rarely, only if I know stuff's just happening and it's changing all the time, because then blogs are going to be talking about it. So I would look for ERISA law blogs. The ABA has a listing of blogs on different topics. And then, again, a lot of these blogs are going to be done by attorneys who are essentially creating these blogs in order to generate business, which is not a bad thing. It's one of the many ways to generate business, but obviously don't rely on that. Learn from it, see if their citations actually say what they say they do. Don't rely on their interpretation of the law saying, oh, you can't sue, you're preempted because they represent insurers, or on the other hand, they represent they're interpersonal injury lawyers, so they want you to come and hire them because they do PI and they want you to sue so they can make money. So you can't rely on their interpretation, but you can learn from them in terms of some of the issues, the terminology, maybe some good statutes, and case citations. Okay, and the last thing on current awareness, we finally, I know a couple of you said last time you want to get to know Bloomberg a little bit better. So Bloomberg has bought out a publisher called BNA. BNA was the place to go for particular areas of law like securities, like tax, labor, pretty much very highly regulated areas of the law. Bloomberg bought out BNA, and they're just now incorporating the BNA publications. So it's a little hit or miss, honestly. So where you want to take a look at the news on BNA, there are basically three ways to get around BNA. You can just search, you can look at the browse menu, and you'd start here at the all content, so you'd see news. Or you could take a look here at what's on the home page. So here on the news, you see Bloomberg Law News, and what you see are a whole bunch of different areas that BNA used to cover. The company name is now actually Bloomberg BNA. They've incorporated the name. So you can see we might want to, for our client, try health and business. Excuse me. And what you see is a newsletter, and that's what these BNA publications were newsletters that came out every week. Since Bloomberg literally just as of January 1st got rid of the old BNA format and is now using what we're looking at now, I can't really tell you if they're going to update. They update it all the time, but whether they're going to have weekly publications the way they used to, I honestly, like I said, don't know. But if you have access to Bloomberg, which obviously for now you do, this would be a way to keep up with what's going on in a particular area if Bloomberg covers your area. Okay, any questions? So we're going to do a workshop on what we've just looked at, but before we do that, I want to go through. So I copied and pasted the screencast questions that many of you left. Thank you for those of you who put questions in that last part of the screencast. So I just want to make sure I've gone over, at least for screencast number 1. We'll do treatises later. Okay, so I've been asked to discuss or go further into why ALR are so useful for research. I think I've done that. Does anybody have additional questions on that? Okay. How to set up alerts. So they took away what I was looking for in alerts. I was about to show you and then didn't see the bell. So I will get back to you on that probably next week. But we'll definitely talk about alerts next week. How to ensure that you have the most updated version of secondary sources. See, good. I'm glad I looked at this because I meant to and did not highlight that for you on Lexis and Westlaw. All right, so really quick. So basically for the publications we've looked at so far, you'll see the updating information up top. So I'll just show you a quick, for instance, on each. So for these kind of encyclopedias, for ALR, for American Jurisprudence, CJS, Lexis and Westlaw will give you an idea, usually at the top, about how up-to-date it is. So here, this is one reason why I don't love ALR on Lexis. We'll see that for treatises, source information. So you can see under the source information, it's updated weekly. Westlaw will be a little more straightforward, I think. In terms of when it's updated, you'll probably actually, if you go to the full table of contents, you'll see this little I link. And again, it'll tell you the last updated. How do you tell whether you have the most up-to-date? You check the date. Sometimes that's not necessarily so important. You may have noticed that .gov, those first site we looked at when we started class that we found last week on our Google search, that was updated either 2004 or 2007, which obviously is quite a while ago. So I wouldn't rely on it telling me what the law is today. I check the statutes and the cases and make sure that nothing has changed dramatically. But it was still a great secondary source. It gave us a lot of explanation. So what you want to worry about not so much is always having you want the most up-to-date primary sources. For secondary sources, you just want to know when it was last updated and then understand whether or not you can rely on it. And we'll see that in more detail when we look at treatises, because we'll see some really useful treatises that aren't necessarily up-to-date in the last month, but still are really useful. But we know that there may be things that have changed since they were last updated, and we can deal with that when we look at the primary sources to make sure our cases are up to date, our statutes are the most updated. And we'll talk a lot about that when we talk about primary sources. Okay. So, If there's a keyword search, but there's not a secondary source regarding the topic you searched, what should be your steps to find more on-point secondary source? Find a different secondary source, just like we saw. CJS, regular AmJur weren't that great. ALR, New York Jur, American Proof of Facts was. So sometimes it's just, I would say, don't narrow. Again, your assignment was look at this specific source. I would say, as I said, a better strategy is just search secondary sources generally. And again, just narrowing to secondary on either Lexis or Westlaw, and then doing a general search, and then just finding something that helps you, and not worry so much. Is it ALR? Is it AmJur? Is it Proof of Facts? Find what's useful. You may also need to think about your search terms. We've learned HMO, maybe managed care, liability. Are we getting too lost in preemption before we understand what we need to search? You also always want to be thinking about, am I actually searching the right issue? So I pointed out that ALR article about finding physicians liable. Well, that's not, I mean, it sounded great initially, that ALR article, but we're not worried about finding physicians liable. We're worried about finding our insurance company liable. So make sure you're asking and answering the right questions. Okay. Are there key secondary sources that you would recommend we go first, or is it's specific to the issue? And definitely specific to the issue. Again, encyclopedias generally are good to start, not always. Sometimes treatises are going to be the best place to start. Okay, when does using a secondary source actually save you time? When you don't know much about the issue. Even sometimes, and again, it depends on your circumstance. It depends on, if you're told, get me an answer in an hour, you don't want to spend a whole lot of time at secondary sources. You may want to see if you can find one really quickly, but you're not going to spend a half an hour just trying to find a good secondary source. So I would say usually a secondary source will save you time, but as with classic law school answer, it depends. It depends on your issue. Okay, clarify ALRs. Are we okay on ALR? Talked about that. How to identify whether a secondary source is reliable. We talked about looking at Google and doing lateral search last class. So that's for what you find on Google. That's one of the advantages, and it's why people spend so much money on Lexis and Westlaw and Bloomberg, because those are vetted by those database owners. So pretty much if you're looking at Lexis, Westlaw, or Bloomberg, I would say it's reliable. You do want to check and make sure it's up to date. Or you want to make sure you know how up to date it is. So you know whether or not you have to do more updating. Okay. Pros and cons, different types of secondary sources. When would I use encyclopedia over ALR? Basically, if you do my suggestion and search secondary sources, you would use whichever sounds good. Whichever answers your question. Okay, that's these questions. Any other questions? Alrighty, let's dive into our first workshop, and then I promise you we will then we will take a break. So I'm going to pass this around. This you can do individually. There should be enough copies, so if I didn't divide them up well, find the pile that's floating around. And while it's floating around, I will go over the instructions. So, asking you to look at the current awareness sources we just talked about. And I'm asking you to look at a specific issue of interest. Maybe you're writing a paper this semester Maybe you're doing a research project for an externship, internship, employer, whatever issue you are interested in. You want to make sure, and this is a general research tip, not just for this exercise, and kind of answer some of the screencast questions. If you're not finding something useful, you also want to think about your search terms in terms of how broad or narrow they are. Maybe if you are, like I keep on suggesting, maybe you really don't want to search for cardiologists. Maybe you want to search for a healthcare provider. So sometimes you want to go a little bit broader. Sometimes it's good to think about, okay, I can't quite tell what topic to look under. What topic would this fall under if I were taking this in law school? So for our example, it might fall under a healthcare class, or it might fall under a tort class. So you might look for resources in those broader areas. So I'm suggesting to you in your first question on Lexis, and I'm asking you to go to Lexis because I'm asking you to go to the New York Law Journal, and you can look in the New York Law Journal. If you don't find something pretty easily, then go to the legal news link. And then remember, you may want to search for that broader topic of whatever your issue is of interest. And then fill in this information. Then I'm asking you to see if you can find a research guide. And then on Bloomberg to look. When you go on to Bloomberg, where's Bloomberg? I'm going to go back to the home. To get back to home on Bloomberg, just click on Bloomberg Law here. And I'm going to ask you to either first try Browse, and then News, and then Bloomberg Law News, and try to see if you can find something. If you don't find something relatively quickly and easier, then on the home page here, you'll see Latest News or U.S. Law Week. And you can try either of those. And only spend a couple of minutes. Bloomberg is very specialized and won't have a lot of topics. For instance, Bloomberg is pretty, doesn't have very much on family law type issues. But if that's your choice, go ahead and use it and just see what you can find, and don't spend a lot of time. And then if you have time, find a blog and number 4. If you don't have time, don't worry about it. I'll be wandering around if you have any questions, and I will collect this. I'm not grading it. You get full credit as long as you give me some answers. The reason I like to look at it, collect it and look at it, is to see if there's an area that a lot of people are getting confused about, because then I can hopefully answer that and address that confusion. Okay. Those alerts. So on Lexis and Westlaw, you can tell Lexis and Westlaw, do this search for me every week, every month, and send me the results. So you don't have to do anything. And on Westlaw, and then remember I was saying I can't find the little bell. Well, here on Westlaw, after you've done your search, the little bell is right there. You see it says create alert, a little pop-up. I don't know if you can read that. And Lexis, pretty much the same thing. And this is what was driving me nuts. The little bell used to be down here, and now they tucked it up here. And you create an alert. Same concept. So, not losing my mind, it's still there. All right, any questions before we dive into treatises? So probably one of the most difficult parts of treatises is defining it. And don't get hung up on the definition, because again, what's important is you find resources that help answer your question. Whether it is a treatise called a treatise or something totally different is far less important. But when I am referring to treatises, I'm generally referring to what we librarians call monographs, or what most people know of as books, whether it's in print or online. Remember, ebooks are online, that are on a specific subject. So unlike ALR, which is general, or an encyclopedia, which is general, a book is on a subject. So you might see a book called tort liability, or constitutional law, or labor law. Those are going to be on, that's what I mean by a particular subject. They were going to tend to be in more depth than what you might find in an article, whether a law review article, again, we'll talk about that next week, or even some of the ALR articles we found. Books are going to be in more detail, and they are by experts, so they are going to be reliable. When to use treatises? That was actually one of the questions asked on the screencast. Usually treatises are going to be later on in the process. And I mean later on, I mean not the first thing you look at. Once you have a sense of what some of the issues are. So now we've got our feet wet and we kind of know we got to worry about ERISA preemption. We're still not exactly sure why, what it is, what it's going to do to us, but now might be a good time to look at a treatise about ERISA preemption to get the details about what is it and why do we care? Do we care? What's going to happen if we are preempted? A treatise is going to help us with those more specific questions. Okay, so how do you find treatises? Anybody remember from the screencast some of my suggestions? You're looking at one of them. Ask a librarian. I'm not joking. Treatises are actually a little bit tricky to find, so calling up and saying, hey, and I get that question from attorneys all the time. They come up to the reference desk and ask for a good treatise on fill-in-the-blank law. Another way, some of you have already answered through the workshop you just did, and that is finding a research guide. Actually, research guides probably the best way. Well, okay, librarian's the best way, but you can't always get a hold of us at 2 in the morning. So at 2 in the morning, when you can't do the best, try finding a research guide. A lot of you found school research guides. One of you is at Harvard, another one of you is at Georgetown. Here at Hofstra, we have research guides. Not quite as many as they do at Georgetown or Harvard. We haven't been around as long. But when we're around a couple of 100 years, we'll have as many also. So I had you pick up the print version online. If you go to our very own Law Library homepage, and if you don't know how to get here, it's through the quick links at the Hofstra Law School page, or you could just Google Hofstra Law Library. And you see a link here, Library Guides. And one of the guides you will see Recommended Legal Treatises, which is actually slightly more updated. Those were printed out, and we had very recent updates to this. And you can just see by different topics, you can find different research guides. So research guides are an excellent way to find treatises. You will also find, I don't know if any of you noticed, I didn't really point it out, but if you look at those research references, remember I mentioned that in ALR, you'll also find research references in the encyclopedias, in AmJur, CJS, Proof of Facts, all of the resources we just looked at, you will find these references and they may refer to treatises. So another excellent way to find treatises. You may also find them looking at other online resources, and I'm going to dive in briefly just to introduce you to different online resources, and I'm going to go back to our Law Library homepage. And in addition to Lexis and Westlaw and Bloomberg, and these other listed here, we have a whole range of different online resources in different areas, some of which have actual treatises online. And one of them is in the tax area, which doesn't help us for our client, but if you were interested in tax and you went to the RIA checkpoint, now what the website is asking me to do is to authenticate, to let it know I am a legitimate Hofstra person who should have access to this database. And the way I do that is using my portal login. You all could do the same. And once we authenticate, I'm now in the RIA database. And looking at the editorial materials, I see here I have treatises. Obviously on tax, because this is a tax database. There are lots of other databases that you might run across that also cover a particular area of law or cover several different areas of law that may have treatises as well. And of course, as we've already seen, Lexis, Westlaw, and Bloomberg have treatises, and we've already, actually let's start with Lexis first. So So you can see you can just narrow straight here to treatises if you know you want to search a treatise. I'm not sure I would recommend that at this stage. You can also, someone asked in the screencast about how you narrow to specific areas or more specific areas for treatises. Lexis, all the services have particular practice areas. So if we were to go to healthcare law, oh, you know what? I forgot to turn on our, oh no, I didn't. Good. So if you go here to healthcare law, scroll down to secondary materials, we see references to some treatises, Healthcare Law Practice Guide. So another way to browse to find treatises rather than to search. You can also do the Google has the I'm feeling lucky option. I kind of call that on Lexis and Westlaw. If you go back to the home page, let's see if Lexis will let me do this. And I want to clear out here. So Lexis will pop up the titles when it feels like it. Sometimes it's difficult to get it to do that. So let's try. I found a couple of tricks to try to get it to do this. So if we go here, I'm going to have to find out why it sometimes gives us the suggested titles and sometimes it doesn't. And I'll be honest with you, I haven't figured that out. I've been spending quite a while trying to. But Lexis will give you that drop down, so I'll show it to you on Westlaw because Westlaw is more reliable about that. The I'm feeling lucky is you type in what you are hoping is in a title, and Lexis will do this when it's in the mood, and Westlaw a bit more reliably will give you titles of that treatises. So ERISA practice and litigation, that might be promising for our ERISA questions. And last but not least, finding on Lexis and Westlaw, you can do a search. Again, if we know we're looking for treatises, I might start in secondary materials and then try whichever part of our search we think is of interest for that moment. So let's go with our bigger general question. And then we can scroll or we can narrow to treatises here as well. Filter to treatises on the left. And so we know medical malpractice might be of interest. Here's personal injury. So in terms of using treatises on Lexis and Westlaw, that was another question in the screencast. A couple of different features you want to know about. And primarily, the table of contents. I know I keep on going on and on about the table of contents, but it's really worth all the effort. So here we see this section I clicked on in this treatise, Personal Injury, 94.03, Action Based on Qualitative Care, Vicarious Liability. Well, if we read on, we might think, well, vicarious liability isn't what we are interested in, but if we look at the section that we come under Chapter 94, Managed Healthcare Organizations, which we have learned that term is relevant to us, and HMO is one type of managed healthcare organization. So if I click on that link, Lexis pops me into the table of contents, and I see action based on quality of care vicarious, but look at that, the section right before action based on direct liability. And if I needed to read up on understanding the managed healthcare industry, which would probably be a great idea because I still need to understand who makes the decisions, what's in the contracts, what is negligence, all these questions that you all have come up. And look at this, the section right after the one Lexis found for us with my search terms is action based on denial of treatment, which sounds pretty much bingo on point. So again, using the table of contents is extraordinarily useful. It won't work 100% of the times, but when it does, boy, is it good. And then I might scroll up and look at some of the other chapters as well, or scroll down and see if any of those are interesting. And the last thing I want to know about the table of contents on Lexis is I'm going up way to the top to the very beginning because, as I was saying earlier, when I'm using secondary sources, I know they may not be super duper current, just updated yesterday. I just want to know how up to date it is. So I am going to look at the what's new or publication information. Sometimes Lexis puts the updating information in one and the other. You just have to guess. I'm going to guess what's new, and sure enough, publication update is there. And Lexis will tell me February 2019, which is actually kind of funny because it's not February 2019 yet. What happens with some of these publications is they just post-date it. So obviously, it's pretty darn up to date. Obviously, they don't know what's going to happen in the future. So that's how I would update on Lexis to see how up to date. So this treatise is quite up to date as well as looking like it's pretty useful. And just to see what. So sometimes if I don't find it in what's new, I would look in the copyright. Questions? Doing the same on Westlaw. Again, I can look at practice areas. I might go to secondary materials and then look at treatises that way. Texts and treatises. Could try the I'm feeling lucky approach, which I already showed you on Westlaw, just typing in a title and see what pops up. And then last but not least, take a look at search results. So here in secondary sources, again, going to our HMO liability. And narrowing by publication type to texts and treatises. In Westlaw, you always have to remember to apply, which I frequently forget. And taking a closer look on Westlaw on how to use treatises, I'm going to scroll down to this treatise, HR Series Compensation and Benefits. Again, we're talking about healthcare benefits. Again, vicarious liability, I'm pretty sure it doesn't apply to us, but once I find something fairly close, and actually, through Westlaw, so if I find something that looks pretty close, I might take a look and see where it comes under in our table of contents. And sure enough, this section, vicarious liability, is part of liability for managed care provider malpractice, which is part of a section, managed healthcare liability issues. So again, our table of contents, extraordinarily useful. Here on Westlaw, you see that breakdown on the side. So again, we see the section before is direct liability. I can look at the overall section, or within the sections under this managed healthcare liability issues. Liability for negligent management of care, that could be interesting. General principles overview, again, could help us out. And again, if we go to the full table of contents, sometimes that's just easier to view that way, honestly, so I'll do that just because I find it easier. There's the ERISA defense. And then this I link, when you go to the full table of contents, will tell you how up to date it is. So again, pretty up to date. Questions? Some of you may have used, or rather, how about I will put this as a question. How many of you know about Google or used Google Books? One tentative, a few tentative hands. Google Books is like a separate section of Google. You won't necessarily pull up books on Google unless you actually first Google Google Books. And then you'll see it's a separate web address, books.google.com, and then you search Google Books. It's worth a try. It's obviously free and easy, as Google always is. The downside is you won't always get full or any text access to whatever books you pull up. It's mostly due to copyright, but it's worth a try to see if you find something that you can actually access. If you can't access it, it might be worth jotting down the title and seeing if you can find that title elsewhere. So this answers one of the questions that you all ask. How do I find books if they're not on Lexis or Westlaw? Google Books. So you'll at least find that it exists, and then we'll talk about how you might find it in just a little while. Okay, so that's how to find treatises online. Any questions? Let's talk a little bit on how to use treatises. We already gave you an introduction in the screencast, and actually the how to use treatises will get started by one last way on finding treatises, which is the library catalog. Library catalog, so Lexicat is Hofstra's catalog, covers all of Hofstra. It will tell you what Hofstra has, both in print and what titles, so what book titles or periodical titles, like journal titles like the Hofstra Law Review, the Hofstra Labor Law Journal, what the library has in print and online. Each library's catalog will tend, so if you go to the New York Public Library, the New York Public Library catalog will tell you what it has online. So searching for the library catalog, actually I should show you the way I get here is actually, you could obviously Google it. If I go back to the Law Library homepage and scroll down, there's a box to search the catalog, or I can go for more options, which brings me to this advanced search, which I usually prefer. So I'm going to search for, again, another version of our search term, healthcare law, and go to search. I could try HMO liability. Now, when you're searching a catalog, because it's not full text, it's not like Lexis and Westlaw that has all of the treatises in full text. A catalog is just going to cover the basic information. By basic information, I mean title, author, and some subject heading terms. So I'm going to be far more general in searching a catalog than I am in going to be searching full text. So that's one of the reasons I search healthcare law rather than HMO liability. And here we see, again, a more general title, Contemporary Issues in Healthcare Law and Ethics. And the main reason I'm going to this is because it's an e-book, which means I can show it to you on the screen just as it would look like in print, because I wouldn't be able to find a print book that we had 21 copies of for you all to look through. So again, I'm going to click on the online link. If you are following along on your laptop, you may be asked to authenticate. The same thing applies. Just put in your portal login, and it will get you here to this e-book, Contemporary Issues. We actually do have the print version as well. So how to use a print treatise, and we'll actually be doing our last workshop in hopefully a couple of minutes, where we'll go into the library to use a print treatise. But for now, pretty much the tools I suggested in the screencast is what you want to do. You might want to start and view the table of contents and maybe browse through I think the CJS group did that, and that worked pretty well. So I might want to take a look at patient care issues or legal and ethical issues in health insurance and managed care. I might want to dive into the index. Sometimes the index can be useful to give me ideas of terms. So I may know, like I know our HMO term, but I might not have heard about managed care yet, so I might not know to look there. So just clicking on H. In the book, I would just turn in the index to H, and I would look for health maintenance organization. And I would just look at these page references. So corporate negligence, 196, ERISA immunity, 197 to 8. If I did know about managed care, obviously taking a look under managed care, see what else. MCO, so that turns out that's an acronym. And so see provider network utilization review. If you may remember, we run into that. So another reference to page 197. So I'm going to jump now to page 196. 196. And again, in a book, this would actually be, whoops, why didn't that work? In a book, this would actually be easy. You just flip the pages, and I might want to flip the page back or scroll up to get to the beginning of the section. So here it talks about tort liability, patient care issues. And here's malpractice in the context of cost containment and managed care. We've learned enough now. And again, this is why sometimes it's better not to go to treatises first, because we've now learned enough to know we may be thinking about malpractice, we've heard about cost containment, maybe that's why our patient got denied her care, and we know that managed care is relevant. So it gives us, again, an introduction. We're going to want to look at the beginning of the treatise to see how up to date it is. The catalog actually told us, I think it's a 2008, but the beginning of the first couple of pages of the treatise would tell us as well. Again, so using the index to help us identify, and just as we've been saying, as I've been saying, the table of contents. So what I sometimes like to do after looking at the brief table of contents is look at a detailed table of contents if there is one. And so we know that around page 196 was interesting, this managed care and context. So that's under this patient care issues. So it gives us some background on the tort of negligence as it applies to health care, because that's what the treatise is about. Legal and ethical obligations. And as we scroll down, we would see that financial incentives to provide less care, which may be what happened to us, controlling utilization. So here we see this utilization review. So again, this seems to be a term of art that we're learning as we look at these different secondary sources. Legal liability for improper denial of claims. So again, scanning the table of contents helped us find at least as good a page reference or section reference as did just using the index or the general table of contents. So hopefully I have convinced you with the value of table of contents. Okay. And a couple of you asked about WorldCat. I mentioned that in the screencast. Basically, I would use WorldCat very rarely. First, if I'm just not finding any treatise and I want to see if something exists. Google Books is another, or just plain Google is another way to do that. The other reason I would use WorldCat is if I did find a title, say on Google Books, and I wanted to figure out where I might find this, I might go to WorldCat. Honestly, a better approach for that would be to go to your favorite library. We'll talk a little bit about using your public library resources next time, but WorldCat would tell you what libraries have a particular title. Now, it's going to tell you all across the country and world, so obviously if they have a title in California, that's not going to help you right now, unless you're going to California tomorrow. So WorldCat, again, is one of those resources I don't think you'll find yourself using very frequently. Since you asked, I wanted to answer the question. Okay, any other questions?